June 15th, 1944. Yawata, Kyushu, Japan. Lieutenant Isamu Kashiide pressed his face against the canopy of his Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu heavy fighter, straining to see the formation approaching from the southwest at 23,000 feet. The silvery giants caught the moonlight, their massive wings spanning 141 feet, each aircraft larger than anything Japanese reconnaissance had reported possible. This cannot be real. No bomber should be this size. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence briefings had been clear. American heavy bombers were coming, but the photographs and descriptions had failed to capture the reality, now filling Kashiide's windscreen. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented technology that Japanese aviation engineers had considered theoretically impossible for operational aircraft. Through his canopy, Kashiide studied the lead bomber, its polished aluminum skin gleaming even in darkness. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, pulled the 60-ton aircraft through thin air with a grace that defied its enormous mass. The bomber flew faster than his fighter could climb to intercept altitude. But what captured Kashiide's attention, what would haunt Japanese fighter pilots for the next 14 months, was not the bomber's size or speed. It was the turrets. 4 remotely controlled gun positions protruded from the fuselage, each housing twin 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The tail position held another 2 50 calibers and a 20mm cannon. 12 heavy weapons in total, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, all controlled by a revolutionary fire control system that Japanese intelligence barely understood. The transformation from American design, concept to Japanese nightmare had begun 4 years earlier, when the United States Army Air Corps issued requirements that seemed to border on fantasy. A bomber capable of carrying 1 ton of bombs 5,300 miles at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, a pressurized aircraft that could operate at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, and defensive armament sophisticated enough to protect the bomber without fighter escort across vast Pacific distances. Boeing's engineering team, led by Wellwood Beale and Edward Wells, approached the challenge with methodical ambition. Every system pushed boundaries. The pressurized fuselage, divided into 3 compartments connected by a crawl tunnel over the bomb bays, allowed crew members to function at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft left men unconscious within seconds. The tricycle landing gear distributed weight across dual wheels that could handle runways no existing bomber could use. The wingspan exceeded that of some Japanese airfields' entire width, but the defensive armament represented the most radical departure from conventional bomber design. General Electric's Central Fire Control System, designated the 2 CFR-55B1, transformed defensive gunnery from individual weapons into an integrated network controlled by analog computers. 5 sighting stations positioned throughout the aircraft, each equipped with a dedicated General Electric computer weighing over 50 pounds, calculated firing solutions that compensated for airspeed, altitude, temperature, humidity, gravity, and the ballistic characteristics of 50-caliber ammunition at combat ranges. The system allowed any gunner to control any turret. The bombardier in the nose could fire the lower forward turret, while the tail gunner overrode control of the rear dorsal and ventral positions. The central fire control officer, seated in what crews called the barber chair above the mid-fuselage, coordinated defensive fire by switching turret control between gunners based on threat assessment. A single gunner tracking a target provided range and speed data to the computer, which then aimed the selected turret with precision impossible through manual operation. American test pilots who flew the B-29 during development described an aircraft that redefined strategic bombing doctrine. The pressurized compartments meant crews could fly 10-hour missions without oxygen masks. The computer-controlled defensive system meant a well-trained crew could engage multiple targets simultaneously. The 4 supercharged engines provided enough power to maintain formation even with one engine shut down and another damaged. Production began in 1942 under conditions that tested American industrial capacity. Boeing's Wichita plant, Bell's facility in Marietta, Georgia, and Martin's operation in Bellevue, Nebraska, worked simultaneously to manufacture components for an aircraft that was still being modified, based on test flight data. The Battle of Kansas, as Boeing engineers called the frantic effort to resolve engineering problems while maintaining production schedules, consumed months of round-the-clock work. Engine fires plagued early models. The Wright R3350 engines, the most powerful production radial engines in the world, generated so much heat that crankcase temperatures exceeded design limits during sustained climbs. Magnesium crankcases, chosen for weight savings, proved susceptible to catastrophic fires that could burn through wing spars within minutes. Test pilot Edmund Allen and his entire crew died on February 18, 1943, when the second prototype's engine caught fire and the aircraft crashed into a Seattle meatpacking plant, killing 19 workers on the ground. The tragedy nearly ended the program. Boeing declared the aircraft no good with too many problems. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, threatened to demand repayment of the $200 million already invested unless Boeing continued production. The company agreed to operate the factories while accepting no responsibility for the airplane. The compromise kept B-29s moving through assembly lines while engineers frantically resolved technical problems. By spring 1944, when the first combat-ready superfortresses deployed to India and China as part of Operation Matterhorn, the aircraft remained temperamental but operational. Crews learned to monitor engine temperatures with obsessive attention. Mechanics developed procedures for managing the 10 miles of electrical wiring that powered remote turrets, computers, pressurization systems, and avionics that filled every available space inside the fuselage. Japanese intelligence tracked these developments with growing alarm. Reconnaissance flights over American-controlled airbases in China photographed massive runway construction projects. The runway extended to lengths exceeding 8,000 feet, far longer than any existing bomber required. Aerial photographs showed enormous aircraft under camouflage netting, their wingspans exceeding any known Allied bomber by 30%. On June 14, 1944, 75 B-29s departed forward bases around Chengdu, China, loaded with 4,000 pounds of bombs each. Their target was the Yawata Imperial Iron and Steel Works on Kyushu, which produced 24% of Japan's rolled steel. The raid marked the first American air attack on the Japanese home islands since Jimmy Doolittle's carrier-launched B-25 raid in April 1942. Japanese radar operators detected the formation while still over the East China Sea. The contact appeared on screens as a massive return, larger than any previous American raid. Controllers scrambled the 19th Air Brigade's fighters from Ozuki and Ashiya airfields. 35 Kawasaki Ki-45. Toryu heavy fighters and 25 Kawasaki Ki-61 high-end fighters climbed to intercept, though only about half reached operational status due to maintenance issues that plagued Japanese aviation by mid-1944. Lieutenant Kashiide's fighter group approached the American formation from the northwest, positioning for a beam attack that doctrine suggested offered the best chance against heavy bombers. His squadron commander had briefed the pilots based on intelligence reports describing the new American bomber. Heavy defensive armament, high operational altitude, speed approaching 300 miles per hour. The briefing had emphasized aggressive attacks pressed to close range, ideally within 250 meters, where fighter cannons could inflict devastating damage despite the bomber's rugged construction. But the intelligence briefings had failed to convey the reality of engaging B-29s in combat. As Kashiide closed to firing range, the bomber formation maintained perfect spacing, each aircraft positioned to provide mutual defensive fire that created interlocking fields covering every approach angle. Tracer rounds arced across the night sky in streams that seemed to fill the air between hunter and prey. The volume of fire exceeded anything Japanese fighter pilots had encountered. The American gunners tracked his approach with mechanical precision. Through his canopy, Kashiide watched turrets rotate smoothly, following his fighter with electronic timing that suggested computer control rather than human aim. He had fought against British bombers over Burma, American B-17, flying fortresses in limited encounters over Pacific targets, and Chinese aircraft of various types. None had demonstrated defensive firepower approaching what he now witnessed. Opening fire at 400 meters, Kashiide aimed for the bomber's No. 3 engine on the right wing. His two 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns converged on the target, walking shells toward the cowling where hits might damage the supercharger or sever fuel lines. But before he could observe results, tracer fire from multiple turrets converged on his fighter. 50 caliber rounds, each projectile weighing 44 grams and traveling at 885 meters per second, punched through his aircraft's thin aluminum skin. The fighter shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage behind the cockpit. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping on the port engine. Hydraulic failure in the starboard landing gear system. Fuel leak detected in the wing tank. Kashiide broke left and dove, abandoning the attack to save his crippled fighter. Below him, the bomber formation continued toward Yawata, seemingly untouched despite attacks from over 30 Japanese fighters. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura, flying another Ki-45 from the 4th Air Regiment, pressed his Kari, attack with determination that bordered on desperation. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, diving from above and ahead, he aimed for the cockpit of a superfortress designated by American crews as Limber Dragon. The head-on attack offered the best chance of inflicting catastrophic damage, targeting the pilots and flight deck systems with cannon fire that could disable the bomber with a single well-aimed burst. The bomber's nose gunner, operating from the bombardier station, engaged Kimura's fighter at maximum range. The General Electric Fire Control computer calculated deflection, adjusted for the combined closure rate exceeding 600 miles per hour, compensated for the curvature of the bullet's trajectory at 23,000 feet altitude, and directed the forward turret's guns with precision impossible through manual aiming. Streams of 50 caliber fire converged on Kimura's approach corridor. Kimura fired his cannons at 300 meters range. 20mm shells struck the bomber's nose glazing, shattering plexiglass panels and destroying instruments in the bombardier's station. But the structural damage proved insufficient. The B-29's stressed skin construction, using heavy-gauge aluminum alloy frames that distributed loads across the entire airframe, absorbed hits that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Redundant control systems meant single failures rarely proved catastrophic. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from small-caliber penetrations. 50 caliber rounds from the bomber's defensive guns found Kimura's fighter at 250 meters. The convergence of fire from nose turret and dorsal turret created a kill zone that the fighter flew directly through. Multiple hits struck the engine cowling, the cockpit canopy, and the wing roots. The fighter exploded in a fireball that briefly illuminated the night sky, marking Kimura as the sole Japanese pilot to down a B-29 on this first raid against the Port and Home Islands, though at the cost of his own life. Of the 68 B-29s that reached Japanese airspace, 60 attacked Yawata, while others diverted to secondary targets or aborted due to mechanical failures. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire claimed one bomber shot down and inflicted minor damage on 6 others. American gunners claimed 17 Japanese fighters destroyed, and 13 probably destroyed, though actual Japanese losses totaled fewer than 5 aircraft. The post-mission intelligence analysis, conducted by both American and Japanese staffs, revealed starkly different interpretations of the engagement. American commanders viewed the mission as proof that B-29s could penetrate Japanese defenses with acceptable losses. Japanese commanders recognized a strategic crisis that threatened the Empire's ability to defend its homeland. The bombers flew too high for most fighters to intercept effectively. They flew too fast for anti-aircraft guns to track accurately, and their defensive firepower exceeded anything Japanese doctrine had prepared fighter pilots to face. At the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, staff officers studied reconnaissance photographs of the bombers taken during the raid. The images showed aircraft configurations unlike any Allied bomber previously encountered. The remotely controlled turrets, visible as small protrusions along the fuselage, suggested automation that Japanese industry had not achieved in operational aircraft. The size alone indicated industrial capacity operating at scales Japanese planners had not believed possible. Captain Takeo Tanimizu, assigned to the Air Defense Command's intelligence section, compiled the first comprehensive report on B-29 capabilities based on pilot debriefings and technical analysis of the engagement. His findings would shape Japanese defensive doctrine for the remainder of the war, though the conclusions offered little comfort to commanders responsible for protecting Japanese cities. The bomber's defensive armament, Tanimizu reported, consisted of at least 10 50 caliber machine guns positioned to provide complete coverage of all approach angles. Forward attacks faced fire from nose guns and the forward dorsal turret. Beam attacks encountered fire from dorsal and ventral turrets, plus possible engagement from nose or tail positions, if gunners had access to multiple turret controls through the central fire control system. Tail attacks faced the most concentrated fire, with tail guns and rear dorsal and ventral turrets creating an overlapping kill zone that made stern approaches suicidal. The fire control system demonstrated characteristics suggesting computerized aim correction. Turrets tracked targets smoothly through wide traverse angles. Gun elevation adjusted continuously to maintain aim on maneuvering fighters. The accuracy exceeded manual gunnery by margins Tanimizu estimated at 3 to 4 times higher hit probability compared to conventional bomber defensive positions. Most critically, the bomber's high operational altitude, typically between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, placed it above the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters. The Ki-43 Hayabusa, backbone of Army fighter forces, struggled to reach 25,000 feet with sufficient speed to overtake the bombers. The Navy's famous A-6M0, optimized for low-altitude maneuverability, performed poorly at extreme altitudes, where thin air reduced engine power and control authority. Only the latest Japanese fighters, specifically the Kawasaki Ki-84 Hayate Frank and the Nakajima Ki-84, with properly functioning engines and competent pilots, could engage B-29s with any realistic chance of success. But production of these advanced types lagged far behind losses. By mid-1944, Japanese aircraft manufacturing faced critical shortages of aluminum, skilled labor, and machine tools necessary for mass production. Monthly fighter output barely replaced combat losses, leaving no reserves for defending the home islands while maintaining forces in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The defensive response to the Yawata raid exposed systemic weaknesses that would only worsen as the war continued. Searchlight batteries struggled to acquire targets at 20,000 feet altitude in clear weather and failed completely when clouds obscured visual tracking. Anti-aircraft guns demonstrated poor accuracy against high-altitude targets traveling at 300 miles per hour, with shell trajectories requiring long time of flight that gave bombers time to maneuver beyond the predicted impact point. Fighter direction lacked the radar-guided precision necessary to position interceptors ahead of bomber formations, where frontal attacks might succeed. Perhaps most troubling to Japanese planners was the realization that B-29 raids from China represented merely the opening phase of a strategic bombing campaign that would escalate dramatically once American forces captured bases closer to Japan. Intelligence reports confirmed American invasions of the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, where the flat terrain and proximity to Japan, just 1,500 miles, made them ideal for massive B-29 operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American capture of Saipan on July 9, 1944, followed by Tinian and Guam through August, transformed the strategic situation in ways that Japanese military planners had dreaded but anticipated. Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees, began constructing massive airfield complexes even before ground combat concluded. 2 airfields on Tinian, 1 on Saipan, and 2 on Guam would eventually host over 1,000 B-29s, creating the largest concentration of strategic bombing power ever assembled. Major Yasuo Kuwahara, commanding a fighter unit at Yokosuka Naval Air Station near Tokyo, received updated intelligence assessments in October 1944 that detailed the scale of American preparations in the Marianas. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed runway construction extending to 10,000 feet in length, far exceeding requirements for any bomber except the Superfortress. Hardstand construction suggested capacity for hundreds of aircraft. Fuel storage facilities indicated preparation for operations consuming millions of gallons of aviation gasoline monthly. The mathematics were inescapable and devastating. If each B-29 could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs to Tokyo from the Marianas, and if American planners deployed 500 bombers, a single maximum effort raid could deliver 10 million pounds of explosives on Japanese targets. Kuwahara's intelligence staff calculated that such raids, repeated weekly or even daily, would systematically destroy every major industrial facility in Japan within months. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29s of Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell's 73rd Bomb Wing departed Isley Field on Saipan, setting course for Tokyo 1,500 miles to the north. The mission, codenamed San Antonio 1, would be the first B-29 strike against the Japanese capital since the Doolittle raid 32 months earlier. Poor weather over the target meant only 88 bombers dropped ordnance, with just 24 hitting the primary target at the Musashino aircraft factory. But the psychological impact on Japanese civilians who watched silver bombers fly over their capital at altitudes beyond the reach of defenses proved profound. Kuwahara led his squadron of Mitsubishi, A-6 M0s, to intercept altitude, climbing desperately toward the bomber formations, cruising at Limassol, 27,000 feet. His fighter, optimized for dogfighting at medium altitudes, struggled in the thin air. The engine, a Nakajima Sakai producing 1,130 horsepower at sea level, delivered barely 800 horsepower at 27,000 feet. The controls felt mushy, responding sluggishly to stick inputs that would produce crisp maneuvers at lower altitudes. Approaching the formation from the port beam, Kuwahara noted the geometric precision of the American box formation. Each bomber maintained exact spacing, positioned so its defensive guns could support neighboring aircraft. The staggered altitude arrangement meant fighters attacking one bomber immediately exposed themselves to fire from multiple others. The formation created a three-dimensional fortress in the sky, bristling with over 1,000 50-caliber machine guns, all directed by computer-assisted fire control. At 600 meters range, the bomber formation opened fire. Kuwahara watched tracer rounds arch toward his squadron in streams that seemed continuous rather than discrete bullets. The visual effect was psychologically devastating even before considering the actual hit probability. Each tracer represented 4 regular rounds, meaning the visible fire accounted for only 20% of the actual projectiles filling the air between fighters and bombers. Kuwahara's training emphasized aggressive attacks pressed to close range. Japanese doctrine stressed that only hits counted, and only determined pilots willing to close to 200 meters or less could reliably hit 4-engine bombers. But closing from 600 to 200 meters through concentrated fire from dozens of guns demanded courage bordering on fatalism. His squadron had lost 30% of its strength in the previous month to combat attrition and training accidents. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 200 flight hours, half the training time considered minimally adequate for combat operations. Opening fire at 400 meters, Kuwahara aimed his two 20mm cannons at the No. 2 engine of the nearest Superfortress. The cannons carried just 60 rounds each, requiring precise fire discipline to make ammunition last through multiple attack runs. His two 7.7mm machine guns added their lighter fire, though he knew rifle-caliber rounds would inflict only superficial damage against the bomber's heavy structure. The bomber's central fire control system tracked his approach with mechanical precision. The left gunner, seated at a blister sighting station midway along the fuselage, acquired Kuwahara's 0 in his optical sight. The gunner held the target in the reticle for 2 seconds, allowing the General Electric computer to calculate range and closure rate. The computer, incorporating data from pitot tubes, measuring airspeed, altimeters, providing altitude, thermometers reading outside air temperature, and gyroscopes sensing aircraft attitude, solved ballistic equations that would require minutes of manual calculation. The computer adjusted for gravity's effect on bullet trajectory. At 27,000 feet altitude, a 50 caliber projectile traveling 800 meters would drop nearly 4 meters due to gravity. The computer compensated automatically. The bomber's motion through the air at 240 miles per hour meant bullets fired straight ahead would impact 36 feet to the right of aim due to the aircraft's forward movement. The computer corrected for this as well. Wind effects, though minimal at altitude, received compensation. Even the temperature affecting air density factored into the firing solution. When the gunner pressed the firing trigger, the selected turret, in this case the upper rear position, rotated smoothly to the computed aim point and fired a burst of approximately 40 rounds. The actual rounds per minute rate of 750 meant each gun fired 12.5 rounds per second, or 25 rounds per second from the twin-gun turret. A 2-second burst sent 50 projectiles downrange, each one capable of penetrating armor plate at combat ranges. Kuwahara Zero, constructed of thin aluminum and fabric over a lightweight frame optimized for agility rather than protection, offered no defense against 50 caliber fire. Multiple rounds struck his aircraft. One punctured the fuel tank behind the engine, though the lack of self-sealing meant fuel immediately began streaming from the hole, creating a fine mist in the slipstream. Another round severed the rudder cable, leaving him with limited directional control. A third struck the canopy frame, spider-webbing the plexiglass and sending fragments into the cockpit that cut Kuwahara's left cheek. He broke off the attack, diving away from the formation while his wingman, Second Lieutenant Nakamura, pressed forward alone. Nakamura's fighter closed to 300 meters before defensive fire from 3 separate turrets converged on his approach corridor. The Zero exploded, possibly from a hit to the fuel tank or ammunition magazine, though the speed of destruction made cause of death impossible to determine. One moment Nakamura's fighter flew straight and level, guns firing. The next moment only flaming debris tumbled toward the Pacific below. Of the 40 fighters that intercepted the November 24th raid, Japanese records documented 6 losses to bomber defensive fire, 3 to operational accidents during combat, and significant damage to 11 others. American gunners claimed 50 Japanese fighters destroyed and 61 damaged, demonstrating the typical overclaiming that characterized both sides' combat reports. But the essential reality was undeniable. Japanese fighters could not prevent B-29 raids from reaching their targets. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command in January 1945. Bringing with him aggressive tactical innovations developed during operations from China. LeMay recognized that high-altitude precision bombing, the doctrine that had driven B-29 design, produced disappointing results against Japanese targets. Cloud cover obscured aiming points on 70% of missions. The jet stream at 30,000 feet created ground speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, making accurate bombing impossible even with the advanced Norden bombsight. More fundamentally, LeMay understood that Japanese industry operated differently than European factories. Germany concentrated manufacturing in large, easily identifiable facilities that made good precision targets. Japan dispersed manufacturing across thousands of small workshops embedded in residential districts. Destroying Japanese war production required destroying the workshops and the districts containing them. On March 9, 1945, LeMay ordered a radical change in tactics that would redefine strategic bombing and demonstrate the B-29's versatility in ways its designers never anticipated. 334 superfortresses would attack Tokyo at night, flying at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, carrying incendiary bombs rather than high explosives, and stripped of most defensive armament to maximize bomb loads. The altitude change alone represented revolutionary thinking. Conventional doctrine held that bombers survived by flying above enemy defenses. LeMay calculated that Japanese heavy anti-aircraft guns, optimized for high-altitude fire, would be ineffective at low altitude, where reduced time of flight required faster tracking. Light anti-aircraft guns, more effective at lower altitudes, lacked the range to engage bombers at 7,000 feet. The altitude band between 5,000 and 9,000 feet created a gap in Japanese defenses, where superfortresses could operate with relative impunity. Removing defensive armament, except for tail guns, reduced aircraft weight by several thousand pounds, allowing each bomber to carry 7 tons of M69 incendiary bombs instead of the normal 4-ton load. The incendiaries, filled with napalm and white phosphorus, were specifically designed to create firestorms in congested urban areas built primarily of wood and paper construction. Japanese night fighter forces, LeMay knew, remained primitive by American standards. Japan had developed few dedicated night fighters. Radar-equipped interceptors existed in tiny numbers. Searchlight batteries around Tokyo, though numerous, struggled to acquire targets through overcast conditions that characterized March weather. The risk calculation favored the attackers. Lieutenant Shigeo Nango commanded a night fighter unit flying Nakajima J-1N Gecko aircraft, equipped with crude centimetric radar. On the night of March 9th, Nango scrambled when ground controllers reported large formations of American bombers approaching from the southeast at unexpectedly low altitude. Climbing to intercept altitude, Nango found the sky filled with B-29s, their presence revealed by exhaust flames from right engines glowing orange against the darkness. What Nango observed as he closed on the bomber stream contradicted everything Japanese doctrine assumed about American tactics. The bombers flew individually rather than in tight formations. They operated at altitudes his fighter could reach easily. Most stunning, they appeared to have removed their defensive turrets, with smooth fairings covering the positions where gun blisters had previously protruded. Nango selected a bomber flying straight and level at 7,000 feet. His radar operator, seated behind him and operating the Type 3 air-to-surface radar, guided him toward the target using radio directions. The radar, primitive by American standards but functional, provided range and bearing information, allowing Nango to position for an attack run without visual acquisition until the final moments. At 500 meters range, Nango armed his 4 20mm cannons and prepared to fire. But as he closed to 300 meters, the bomber's tail turret rotated toward him, the movement smooth and deliberate. Even stripped bombers retained tail defenses, and those tail guns now represented the sole defensive armament. The tail gunner, watching his approach through a clear plexiglass position, held fire until Nango reached optimal range. At 200 meters, 350 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The B-29's tail position, upgraded from the original 2-gun configuration, now mounted 3 Browning M2s specifically to counter the rear attacks that Japanese doctrine emphasized. The night fighter, designed for stealth approach rather than rugged construction, absorbed multiple hits. 20mm cannon shells from Nango's own guns struck the bomber's tail, damaging the rudder and severing one elevator cable, but the Superfortress continued flying. Nango's fighter, critically damaged, lost power, and began descending. He managed to nurse the crippled aircraft to an emergency landing at Mobara Naval Air Station, but the fighter was destroyed beyond economical repair. The bomber he'd attacked reached Tokyo, dropped its incendiary load on the Shitamachi district, and returned safely to Tinian despite tail damage that required 3 weeks of repair work. Over Tokyo that night, 279 bombers dropped 1,651 tons of incendiaries on the most densely populated square mile on Earth. The Shitamachi district, home to over 1 million residents living in wooden structures separated by narrow lanes, erupted in flames that merged into a firestorm, consuming 15 square miles. Temperatures at the fire's center exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hurricane-force winds created by the thermal updraft sucked oxygen from the streets, suffocating thousands who survived the initial flames. Approximately 88,000 people died that night, more casualties than the atomic bombing of Nagasaki 4 months later. Japanese fighter forces attempting to defend Tokyo faced impossible odds. 30 night fighters managed to intercept the bomber stream. They claimed 3 B-29s shot down and possibly 9 others damaged. American losses totaled 14 bombers, most to anti-aircraft fire or operational accidents rather than fighter action. The exchange ratio, even using inflated Japanese claims, meant defenders destroyed one bomber for every 100 that successfully attacked. Captain Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with over 60 confirmed victories, flew defensive missions throughout March and April 1945. His post-war memoir, Samurai, described the psychological burden of fighting an enemy whose material superiority made victory impossible, regardless of pilot skill or courage. Every night, he wrote, bombers came. Every night, fires consumed another section of Tokyo or Yokohama or Nagoya. Every night, fighters rose to intercept, knowing their actions would not prevent the destruction below. Sakai described an encounter on April 13th when he led a formation of 6 Mitsubishi, a 6M0s, against a B-29 formation returning from a raid on Tokyo. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, diving from 30,000 feet toward bombers cruising at 25,000, Sakai's squadron executed the attack profile that doctrine taught offered the best chance of success. Frontal attacks minimized exposure time to defensive fire and targeted the bomber's cockpit and forward fuselage, where catastrophic damage might kill the pilots. At 1,000 meters range, the bomber formation opened fire. Sakai watched turrets rotate toward the diving fighters, tracking smoothly despite the high overtake speed. The combined closure rate, his fighter diving at 400 miles per hour toward bombers flying at 240 miles per hour, exceeded 640 miles per hour, or 940 feet per second. From 1,000 meters to firing range at 300 meters required approximately 2.4 seconds, giving defensive gunners minimal time to acquire, track, and engage. But the General Electric fire control computers required only fractions of a second to calculate firing solutions. Gunners who acquired targets at 1,000 meters and held them in sight during the closure fed continuous data to computers that predicted intercept points and adjusted gun aim in real time. When Sakai reached 300 meters, multiple turrets fired simultaneously, creating a cone of fire he flew directly through. Sakai fired his two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, aiming at the left-hand bomber's cockpit. His cannon shells struck the nose, glazing and forward fuselage, shattering plexiglass and destroying instruments. But the bomber maintained flight, its redundant control systems allowing the co-pilot to continue flying even with the pilot's instruments destroyed. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Armored bulkheads protected critical systems. Sakai's wingman, Lieutenant Fujita, pressed his attack aggressively, closing to 150 meters before firing. His cannon fire struck the bomber's No. 3 engine, destroying the supercharger and setting the cowling ablaze. But at 150 meters, Fujita flew directly into the concentrated fire from the bomber's forward dorsal turret. 50 caliber rounds struck his engine, cockpit, and left wing. The fighter disintegrated, possibly from structural failure when the wing separated, killing Fujita instantly. Breaking away from the formation after his attack run, Sakai counted his squadron's results: 1 bomber damaged and smoking from No. 3 engine, though maintaining formation and continuing toward Tinian. 1 bomber with visible nose damage but flying normally. 1 fighter lost with pilot killed. 2 fighters damaged and returning to base. The mathematics of attrition warfare condemned Japanese defenders to inevitable defeat. By May 1945, LeMay commanded over 500 operational B-29s in the Marianas, with more arriving weekly. The bomber force flew missions daily when weather permitted, sometimes launching over 500 bombers in a single raid. Japanese cities burned systematically. Tokyo's major districts lay in ruins. Nagoya lost 60% of its industrial capacity. Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, Kawasaki each suffered devastating firebomb raids that killed thousands and destroyed entire neighborhoods. Japanese fighter production, already strained by material shortages and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities, collapsed under the sustained assault. Monthly fighter output declined from approximately 700 aircraft in January 1945 to fewer than 300 by July. Pilot training programs, starved of fuel and aircraft, produced aviators with barely 100 flight hours, half the time American pilots received. Combat experience that had taken years to accumulate died with veteran pilots faster than new pilots could learn basic skills. The defensive response to B-29 raids evolved through desperation rather than effectiveness. Ramming attacks, where pilots deliberately crashed their fighters into bombers, became increasingly common as ammunition shortages made conventional attacks impractical. Some units modified fighters to carry heavy-caliber cannons or rockets intended for ground attack, weapons poorly suited to air combat, but capable of destroying bombers with a single hit if the pilot could achieve proper firing position. The Kawasaki Ki-109, a specialized high-altitude interceptor, armed with two 30mm cannons and two 20mm cannons, represented Japan's attempt to create a bomber-destroyer capable of engaging superfortresses effectively. The heavy armament could shred a B-29 with a 2-second burst, but production totaled fewer than 100 aircraft before the war ended, too few to influence outcomes. Most units never saw a Ki-109. Major Kuwahara, promoted to command a composite air group defending the Tokyo area, submitted his final operational assessment to the Air Defense Command in July 1945. His report, classified secret and distributed only to senior commanders, concluded that Japanese air defenses could not prevent American strategic bombing regardless of tactics, pilot quality, or numerical strength. The fundamental problem was technological and industrial rather than tactical. American bombers, Kuwahara wrote, represented integrated weapons systems where every component reinforced defensive capability. The pressurized fuselage allowed crews to function at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach. The 4 supercharged engines provided power margins, allowing damaged bombers to maintain formation. The self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection prevented catastrophic failures from single hits. Most critically, the computer-controlled defensive armament created fields of fire that made close approaches suicidal, while long-range attacks proved ineffective against the bomber's rugged construction. The defensive armament's sophistication particularly impressed Kuwahara. Japanese intelligence had eventually pieced together accurate specifications from examination of crashed B-29s and interrogation of captured crewmen. Standard configuration carried 10 to 12 50-caliber machine guns arranged in 5 turrets, 4 remotely controlled and 1 manually operated in the tail. Later modifications added guns to the forward dorsal turret, increasing total armament to 12 or even 13 weapons. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute, though gunners received training to fire in short bursts to prevent overheating. The combined rate of fire from all turrets, if a bomber engaged targets on multiple bearings simultaneously, could exceed 7,000 rounds per minute. Ammunition capacity varied by turret position, but totaled approximately 11,000 rounds per aircraft, enough for sustained defensive engagement throughout a 10-hour mission. The General Electric fire control computers represented technology Japanese industry could not replicate. The analog computers, using cell-in motors and mechanical calculating elements to solve ballistic equations in real time, required manufacturing precision and electronic component quality beyond Japanese capability. Even if specifications had been captured intact, reproducing the systems would have required tooling, materials, and expertise Japan lacked in 1945. Kuwahara's report noted that even stripped bombers operating at low altitude with minimal defensive armament remained difficult targets. The aircraft's speed, approaching 300 miles per hour at medium altitude, meant fighters required proper positioning to execute successful attacks. The structural strength meant hits from rifle-caliber guns or even light cannon produced damage but rarely catastrophic failures. Only heavy cannon, 30mm or larger, reliably destroyed B-29s with limited hits, and Japanese fighters carrying such weapons suffered performance penalties that made interception difficult. The assessment concluded with recommendations Kuwahara knew would never be implemented. Japan needed fighters specifically designed for bomber interception rather than dogfighting, high-altitude engines with superchargers or turbochargers, providing full power above 30,000 feet. Heavy cannon, preferably 40mm or 50mm, capable of destroying bombers with 1 or 2 hits. Radar-directed fire control, allowing all-weather operations. Production rates of at least 1,000 fighters monthly to replace combat losses and build reserves. None of these capabilities existed in July 1945. None would materialize before the war ended. Japanese aviation industry, systematically destroyed by the same B-29 raids it was supposed to counter, operated at 20% of peak capacity. Aluminum stocks, never adequate, had been exhausted. Skilled workers, drafted into military service or killed in bombing raids, could not be replaced. Machine tools, impossible to import and too complex for domestic production, wore out without replacement. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, B-29s of the 509th Composite Group dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The aircraft selected for these missions, Enola Gay and Bockscar, represented modified silverplate variants with specialized equipment for nuclear weapons delivery. But they retained the same basic airframe, the same defensive capabilities, the same operational characteristics that had made the Superfortress invulnerable to Japanese defenses throughout the strategic bombing campaign. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, over 1,000 B-29s sat at airfields across the Marianas, prepared for continuation of the bombing campaign that had systematically destroyed Japanese cities and military capacity. The bombers had flown approximately 33,000 combat sorties, dropped 170,000 tons of bombs, and encountered 11,000 fighter attacks over Japan. Gunners claimed 714 Japanese fighters destroyed, though actual losses were certainly lower due to typical overclaiming. The price of this bombing campaign, from the Japanese perspective, exceeded anything anticipated when the first B-29s appeared over Yawata in June 1944. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after Japan's surrender, estimated that bombing killed approximately 330,000 Japanese civilians, injured 476,000, and destroyed 2.2 million buildings. Approximately 40% of the built-up area of 66 major cities had been destroyed by incendiary attacks. But the B-29's impact extended beyond physical destruction. The bombers' appearance over Japanese cities demonstrated American technological and industrial superiority in ways no battlefield defeat could match. Japanese civilians watched formations of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of massive silver aircraft flying beyond the reach of defenses, dropping tons of explosives with precision that targeted specific districts or factories. The psychological effect was devastating. Major Kuwahara survived the war and lived until 1991. His post-war writings, published in aviation journals and historical compilations, provided detailed accounts of Japanese defensive operations against B-29s. He acknowledged the bombers' technological sophistication while noting that Japan's defeat stemmed less from any single weapon's capabilities than from the overwhelming industrial disparity between combatants. The defensive armament, while impressive, merely reflected American approaches to integrated weapons systems. Where Japanese designers optimized individual components, American engineers designed complete systems where every element supported the overall mission. The B-29's pressurization supported high-altitude operations that required computer-controlled turrets because manual gunnery was ineffective at extreme altitudes. The turrets required a heavy structure that the 4 powerful engines could carry. The engines needed the sophisticated fuel systems and maintenance support that American logistics provided. Everything connected to everything else in a network of technological and industrial capacity. The 1250 caliber machine guns that so impressed Japanese defenders represented just one element of a bomber that redefined strategic air power. The guns themselves, reliable Browning M2s that had equipped American forces since before the war, were evolutionary rather than revolutionary. But their integration into a centralized fire control system, operated by gunners sitting in pressurized compartments separated from the weapons they controlled, transformed defensive gunnery from individual skills into systems operation. Japanese intelligence, examining wreckage from crashed B-29s throughout the war, documented every technical detail they could extract. Engineers measured turret traverse rates, studied computer internals, analyzed ammunition feed mechanisms, inspected hydraulic systems. They understood how the systems worked. But understanding provided no path to replication. The gap between knowledge and capability, between specifications and production, proved unbridgeable given Japan's industrial constraints in 1944 and 45. The lesson the B-29 taught, though few Japanese leaders acknowledged it explicitly during the war, was that modern warfare had become fundamentally industrial rather than martial. Victory belonged not to the bravest warriors, but to the nation that could produce more weapons, train more crews, sustain longer campaigns, and absorb heavier losses while maintaining offensive operations. Japan could produce capable fighters and train skilled pilots, but producing them faster than combat consumed them, while simultaneously defending against strategic bombing that destroyed the factories building replacement aircraft proved impossible. The Superfortress crews who flew the strategic bombing campaign faced their own challenges: engine fires, mechanical failures, weather hazards, navigation difficulties over vast Pacific distances, and Japanese defensive fire that, while ultimately ineffective strategically, could destroy individual bombers and kill entire crews. Of the 3,970 B-29s built during the war, approximately 514 were lost in combat operations, a loss rate of about 1.4% per sortie. For crews flying 35 mission combat tours, the statistics meant better than even odds of survival, but individual missions sometimes saw loss rates exceeding 10%. But from the Japanese perspective, watching from the ground as bombers passed overhead beyond the reach of defenses, the B-29 represented technological dominance that made resistance futile. The bomber flew too high to reach, too fast to intercept reliably, too strong to destroy with light weapons, and too numerous to stop through attrition. Its defensive firepower, integrated through computer control that Japanese industry could not match, created protected corridors through which bomber streams could fly to any target in Japan. The 12 guns were unstoppable, not because 50-caliber machine guns possessed magical properties, but because they represented one component of a complete weapons system designed, built, and operated by an industrial power operating at scales Japan could not match. Understanding this system, documenting its capabilities, even admiring its engineering, provided no solution to the strategic problem it created. The bombers would continue coming until Japan surrendered or until American forces had destroyed every target worth bombing. On September 2, 1945, as Japanese officials signed surrender documents aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, 462 B-29s flew overhead in precise formations, a final demonstration of American air power. The Silver Bombers, their defensive turrets still operational, their computer-controlled guns ready to engage any threat, their massive engines pulling them through Japanese skies that no longer held defenders, represented victory through industrial and technological superiority that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. The war was over. The bombers had won, and Japanese defenders who had fought them throughout 14 months of systematic destruction understood better than anyone that some weapons systems cannot be countered through tactical innovation or individual heroism. Sometimes the mathematics of industrial capacity determine outcomes regardless of martial virtues. The B-29 Superfortress, with its revolutionary defensive armament and integrated fire control, had taught that lesson definitively, expensively, and finally.